Greetings and salutations, friends. I will be doing a video on the Necrons quite soon, but before we can talk about the Necrons, about the undead killer robots of 40k, there's no way we can't first have a look at their would-be masters, the C'tans. They are not what we would usually consider living creatures, quite fitting, really, considering they end up creating an army of metallic undead. They are so different from what we would normally consider life to be like that describing them accurately in their natural state is a little problematic. Essentially, though, they are beings of energy, more so than materia. They are intelligent, but not in quite the same way that we are. It would perhaps be accurate to compare the C'tans to beings of chaos. They have, in all due technicality, free will and a mind of their own, but this is a mind shaped over the course of millions, if not billions of years, and with the influence of uncounted species that they have either observed from afar, or simply eaten. Some even say that the C'tans are the oldest living things in the universe, having been created at the dawn of time from the incredible amounts of energy that the creation of the universe would have required. At that point in time, however, the C'tans were essentially mindless predators with virtually no concept of intellect. Think massive star-sized jellyfish, and you won't be too far off the point. Like jellyfish, they started to drift across the universe, feeding off the residual energy from the creation of the universe, peacefully, majestically, like a fat woman in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And just like a morbidly obese female slowly being buffeted around a swimming pool by a light breeze, the C'tans eventually got hungry. And when they did, they got really hungry. And instead of a nice salad, they went for eating entire stars. It was this particular dietary choice that earned them the name star vampires. But things got more interesting later on, because to begin with, they're eating stars. There's plenty of stars in the universe, it is a big place after all, and it takes them quite a while to devour an entire star's energy, because, well, there's a lot of it. And to begin with, at least, the universe was an empty place as far as, life went. Some primitive animals here and there, sure, but nothing substantial, and so the C'tans went on their merry way of om-nom-nomming a path across the universe, until eventually they started taking notice of a side effect of their feasting. No one really knows when or how it came to be, but the C'tans started to take notice of the primitive beings on the worlds affected by their star diet. Previously, the C'tans had ignored virtually anything not directly related to their own hunger. But now, they got a whiff of something more delectable. The primitive creatures whose stars they were over the course of centuries devouring appeared distraught. Fearful, even. It is important to remember that these star vampires had virtually no concept of anything other than themselves and their hunger, and so these new emotions were a treat to them, to such an extent that they began to enjoy this more than the energy they gained from devouring stars. Fortunately for the C'tan known as the Nightbringer, the primitive creatures inhabiting the solar system he was currently feeding on were a clever bunch of savages and devised a means of communication. This greatly amused the Nightbringer, and so he answered in kind, eventually developing what could only be described as a master-servant relationship with this young race that called themselves the Necrontyr. On their side, the Necrontyr were promised a release from their somewhat shitty existence in return for their servitude. You see, the Necrontyr were the proverbial losers of the Great Galactic Lottery. Their sun, even before it became a smorgasbord for C'tan, released massive amounts of radiation, making life on the Necrontyr homeworld exceptionally short and unpleasant. To make matters worse, when they attempted to escape from their shitty homeworld by settling other planets, they ran into the old ones who had already settled most of the good planets, leaving the shitty ones for the Necrontyr. To further piss in their cornflakes, the old ones refused to give the Necrontyr restorative technology that could have cured the Necrontyr race of the many uncomfortable side effects of living in a radiation hellhole for millions of years. The Necrontyr had most certainly drawn the intergalactic short straw, and so it is easy to imagine why they would be so willing to sell themselves into servitude to the C'tans, seeing as they promised to fix their little sun problem. Oh, and of course, in addition to the sun, well, as you might imagine, the Necrontyr were a wee bit pissed with the Old Ones, considering that it essentially just told them to go fuck themselves and go die in their radiation hellhole, and essentially declared war on them. So, yeah. Now, the Necrontyr are dying from sun radiation, while fighting a war against a empire that pretty much spans the entire known galaxy. Yeah. They weren't in a particularly good position, and to them it must have seemed like the C'tans were the perfect answer to their problems. I mean, what's the worst that could possibly happen, eh? As a bonus, the C'tans were given access to advanced Necrontyr technology, which let these massive thousands of kilometers long interstellar vampires squeeze themselves into molds of living metal. This might at first sound kind of counterproductive. After all, why be a relatively normal-sized, although robotic and magnificently shiny dude, when you can be a massive star-eating monster? Well, the simple answer is that they really liked the feel, so to say, of personally murdering things. And so, this was a good way of doing it, because you can eat a star and the people on the nearby planet would hardly notice for thousands of years, but if you stab them through the heart with the sharp pointy object, the result is far more immediate, as you can imagine. But back to that lovely promise of immortality. Because, of course, there were some limitations, You can't just give them immortality right off the bat, because, well, at that point they're probably not going to be very cooperative yet, so the C'tans needed to buy some time. So, even though the Necrontyr would have to do their new masters one tiny little favour before they, fulfilled, shall we say, their end of the bargain, they weren't too worried about it. After all, how bad can it be? I mean, one tiny little favour and then immortality. That can't possibly be that bad of a deal. And indeed, the price for immortality would come at the low price of everything. The overwhelming majority of the Necrontyr race were turned into soulless, mindless automatons, bound forever to the will of their masters. Because you see, a few Necrontyr were allowed to keep their personalities, their ability to reason, their agency, if you will, although the C'tans did keep them on a mighty short leash. They were technically free to do as they wished, and as they wished with the rest of the now Necron civilization. However, they would have to continue the war against the Old Ones. The C'tans were not about to end their buffet just because their servants were a little bit pissy about their terms of their agreement. You see, the C'tans found their new diet of pain and suffering far more appealing than their old diet of sun energy. And this war that the Necrontyr had going with the Old Ones was the perfect way for them to indulge. Unfortunately, however, the Necrontyr really didn't stand any real chance against the Old Ones. The Old Ones were just far too powerful for the Necrontyr. And so this was a wonderful way of killing two birds with one stone. The C'tans got to technically fulfill their promise, and, make the promise in the first place of immortality, and in return, they got an army of undying robots, which is quite the advantage when you're essentially fighting a war of attrition. With their new shiny army of metallic toys, the C'tans could continue their buffet tour of the galaxy, as they no longer had to worry too much about break time. After all, if you break a humanoid, that's all kinds of hassle to put them back together again, plus that inconvenient convalescence period. With robot warriors, however, all you need is a welder, an oil change, and a quick spit and polish, and you are ready to go again. Okay, that's slight oversimplification, I agree, but you get the general idea. This put the Old Ones and their various subject races on the back foot until eventually they were losing pretty darn bad. Unfortunately for the Necrons, however, they were eventually overwhelmed by the Old Ones' creations and pushed to the brink of defeat. And then shit happened. Lots and lots and lots of mind-enslaving shit in the form of the Enslaver Plague. I've talked about this before in the War in the Heavens video, and I will go into a bit greater detail in the upcoming Necrons video, so for the moment all you need to know is that everything went to hell in a handbasket very quickly indeed. And this is the point where we have one of those lovely canon conflicts. You see, back in the original Necron Codex, the C'tans retained control over the Necrons and essentially used them as a subjected slave army. But in the new Codex, the Necron leadership managed to trick the C'tans, probably with cake, considering their appetite, and trapped them, though trapping is only a kinda correct way of putting it. They somehow restrained them and furthermore shattered them into shards. These shards contained enough power to be a pretty dang good boomstick, though with some fairly severe risks bound to its use, that could be used to control their former masters and use them as weapons. Personally, I kinda like the new version of this law. It's a bit more of a magical explanation, which I'm not usually overly fond of, but in this case, I really like the idea of a power struggle between Necrons and their former masters. So, I think we'll go with the shard theory. With their powers now hugely diminished after being shattered, the C'tans could be controlled with a relative degree of safety. But of course, having their powers hugely diminished also, well, diminished their powers. I know, obvious, right? But they are still plenty dangerous, nowhere near their old levels of nope, but they do still maintain quite a lot of power and some elements of their previous personalities. Thought, and while they are technically controlled by the Necrons, that does not mean they are entirely free of their own, well, agency, so to say. They are not quite the bug-free software the Necrons had perhaps hoped they would be. For example, a shard certainly has the power to murder dozens, if not thousands, of guardsmen by blinking. But if the shard's original personality prefers doing it in some other less effective way, then that is what's going to happen. And remember, the C'tans originally fed off the feelings of fear and hopelessness that their victims experienced. And so very few of them actually have any interest in quick and clean killing. They prefer to drag it out a bit and really get that fear and comfortableness flowing. This preference for playing with their food can often leave the shard vulnerable, and it is by no means indestructible. In fact, it can be quite fragile, as all it will take to destroy a shard is to make a hole in its admittedly extremely tough armor. If such a gap is created, the C'tan's power inside will simply vanish out of the shard. In situations where normal shards won't do because of this weakness, however, the Necrons have developed, or accidentally created is perhaps more correct, the so-called Transcendent C'tan shards. Notice the plural here. These beings are created from multiple shards, and so their power is massively increased to the point where they are no longer all that fond of servitude, because their personalities are also increased, and so they will continuously try to escape. This is prevented by a complex set of mechanisms and failsafes, where the shard's own power is siphoned off and used to create an energy shield capable of containing the shards. This is still a massive strain on the containment vessel itself, and so a small army of automated repair scarabs are constantly repairing and reinforcing the containment vessel, known as a Tesseract vault. Even with this, though, there's no guarantee that the extremely angry glowing green man inside will not get out, and so these Catan shards are only deployed in the most dire of circumstances. And finally, it is important to remember that not all the Catans are accounted for, and as such, it is extremely likely that some of them are still out there in the galaxy, or the universe at large, biding their time until they can teach their rightful slaves about the price of insurrection. Remember, Catans don't think like us. They like pain, they like suffering, and they consider themselves to be above absolutely everything. To them, all other creatures are ants. And these particular ants have had the sheer brazen brass balls, quite a convenient metaphor actually in this particular case, to bite their masters. And their masters will not be forgetting this anytime fucking soon. Not to mention, of course, that seeing as transcendent Catans are a thing, this means that if the shards are gathered, there's a pretty good chance that the originally enslaved Cathans could also be recreated, which creates a potential knock-on effect. If one of the rebel Catans managed to free some of their brethren, well, let's just say that this particular pile of shit is going to pick up some mighty serious momentum as it rolls downhill. For the moment, however, the Necrons can consider themselves to be relatively safe from the ire of their former masters, or at least the few Necrons that remain with any iota of free will can consider themselves to be relatively safe. Relatively speaking, as we are of course talking about massive star vampires here, but on the other hand, the Necrons have proven themselves to be some pretty damn freaky motherfuckers themselves, not to be underestimated. And the best part of this grudge match is both sides are immortal. I have been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you again soon. Have a good day.